has him lift that staff, and the waters part, and God's people pass through on dry ground, and the enemy is swallowed up. So what do? What would you do if God delivered you from bondage and slavery and the whip of Pharaoh and humiliation and degradation and no hope for your offspring, your children, or your grandchildren, and brought you through a parted, frightening body of water on dry ground, only to douse your enemies and erase all fear? What would you do? They began to sing praises. They began to shake a tambourine and dance. In fact, they said, "Who is like you, Lord? Awesome in glory, working wonders." It was a beautiful celebration, a beautiful time of worship. This God who led them out of bondage deserved all this praise. He had shown himself in power and grace and faithfulness in amazing ways. And then they headed for the wilderness. They'd been free 1 month. And those same lips that sang of God's faithfulness, that timbrel that shook, and those feet that danced, were not happy with the situation. They began to mumble and grumble against Moses and Aaron. Their feet hurt, their stomachs were empty. They're probably sick of looking at each other at that point, right? And they wish they were back in captivity. At least there they had pots full of meat, they say. The cuisine was better. They could count on that. And all the bread they could eat. Our stomachs were satisfied. Moses, they thought, brought him away from a banquet to let him die in the desert. Where was their faith? And God hears the cry of his own people, and God makes a promise. He'll rain down food from heaven. God will make a way. God will provide a miracle. God will sustain them. There will be food in the morning, enough for that day, he tells them. And then on the 6th day, so that they can have Sabbath rest, they'll have twice as much. But they need to follow God's instruction and not their bellies, not their preferences, not their groanings and moanings. Moses said, "In the morning you'll see God's glory. There would be bread in the morning and quail in the evening. God has heard your complaints, because your complaints aren't against us." And if you're one of those people who's on the receiving end of that, if you're in leadership or some area where you're doing God's work and you're getting beaten up for it, Moses had that happen. And he said, "You cried out to God. You told him you wanted to be delivered, and what did God do but send me? So your complaint's not with me. He heard your prayer. He delivered you. Your complaint is with God." Why does God provide? He says, "Then you will know I am the Lord your God." He gives us good things that will know him. He put humanity in a garden with everything we needed, with abundance, that we would know who he is, that he's the giver of all good gifts. I think this story needs to be taught in church and repeated in church. I know it's familiar. You could have all stood up and told it this morning, I have no doubt. But it's such a relatable story, because I think we all know what it's like to have short-term memory when we get grumpy. We know what it is to come through a pandemic. I'm going to confess this morning, come through a pandemic and then complain that our restaurants don't have product, or that it's not served as well. Oh, there's some other people are guilty. It's okay. We'll forgive one another this morning. We forget so quickly how easily things can be lost and taken from us, and we forget to have a grateful heart. We know what it is to be Moses and Aaron, serving God and having people murmuring. "Well, you didn't do it my way. You didn't do it the way I liked. You didn't do it quickly enough. You didn't do it the way the last song leader did it. We'll pick on you. You've got broad shoulders. I can pick on you." But here's the problem with murmuring. The problem with murmuring, and if there's coaches here, you got to know this is right. Murmuring is not effective. Grumbling and griping is just not effective. It's like yawning in public. It's infectious. It's not effective in solving our problems, but it is infectious. When we start grumbling and complaining and looking at the negative, that becomes our habit. Others around us begin to do that. We teach our children to have that sort of a mindset. That can become our way to cope with stress, or our way to cope with hardship, our way to cope when anything's uncomfortable, but we're not coping effectively if we're just murmuring and grumbling and blaming others. In fact, it can become a facet of your personality. If you ever saw Debbie Downer on a certain TV show on Saturday evenings, it's funny, and we probably all know one that you avoid at the supermarket or you avoid in public, because what are they going to do? They're going to murmur and grumble. You all know them because you're smiling. That can become a habit. And what it does, it prevents us from maturing in our faith, or from practicing grown-up skills like solving our problems or helping one another or sharing what it is we need to do better. God asked that the manna in the desert be placed in the Ark of the Covenant. You remember that ark that King David, God's presence is there? God wanted manna in there with Aaron's staff that had budded, and of course with the 10 Commandments, right? The first covenant of the law. Why did God want manna thrown in there? Little wafers thrown in there? Because it's a testament to God's provision daily in the wilderness. And he wanted future generations to say, what's that? And why is that there? And I love to have unleavened bread during Lent. I don't know if you do that, because I like for people to say, why are we eating pita bread? Why are we eating a cracker, matzah? Well, there was a time when God's people left in such a hurry because he freed them from bondage that they left before their bread would leaven, and we remember that. Mumbling can become a legacy that we leave our children. Or we can let praise be our testimony. We can let our words be about the goodness of God. I had a mother that used to stand at the sink and sing. She would sing choruses. Did you know whisper a prayer in the morning, whisper a prayer at noon? Do you know that one? Whisper a prayer in the evening to keep your heart in tune. She would sing that. And that's her testimony and something that she handed down to me. Our Christian faith, even though we know it, we forget it, it's not dependent upon our physical well-being or our sensory fulfillment or getting all of the things, the pleasures and the things that we want. Our Christian faith is not dependent upon getting all the things we want. Even a faith that's dependent on miracles or big shows of God, that'll fail to inspire us over time. Look at the miracles God's people saw coming out of the desert. A pillar of fire at night, a Red Sea parting, walking through on dry ground, and yet even that wasn't enough to sustain them when they became uncomfortable and concerned and facing the unknown. They were on a journey that God promised to complete. They were going into a land where they would thrive and have an identity and a purpose. And that is our faith journey. He's leading us to a place ultimately, when we reach the church triumphant, but he's leading us into places in our lives where we grow in our faith and we thrive and we have greater and greater purpose and identity as followers of Jesus Christ. But we forget when we become uncomfortable. Our satisfaction in life comes through healthy relationship. And that has to start with a healthy relationship to God, listening for his voice, listening to one another. Or we can become really hardened to life because it can be tough. Relationship is staying in the fire when the heat gets turned up, so that dross comes off and we're refined and we're better for it and we develop character. When the going gets tough, we want to be people who remain faithful, like Joseph in Egypt. Because the amazing truth of what God has done in our lives and what he promises to do needs to be shared. It needs to be handed off to the next generation. And that's the greatest thing we can do with our time on this earth. That's the greatest thing we can do with our words. It's the greatest thing we can do with our testimony. I think we all honestly want a little more out of life, right? We want to do a little better than our parents or our grandparents. Sometimes we want the best of the best. We want to exceed the status maybe of our parents and our family. We want to have plenty. We want to worry less and leave good things for our children. We want to be able to hold up our heads in the community. We don't want to be embarrassed by the clothes we wear or the car that we drive. And God just says to us, trust me daily. Give me my daily bread. Allow my presence to be enough. Allow my promises to be your true north. And you'll be healthier. You'll be happier. You'll be faithful because you'll be in the center of God's will for your life. You might be familiar with the expression that our brains aren't able to focus on two things at the same time. We can't be a grumbler and grateful. We can't be complaining and praising God. When our brain is going one direction, it makes the negativity fade into the background. Our perspective changes when we practice gratitude. There is actually, I believe that God is the author of science, that he's given us amazing insights that have helped us, helped humanity throughout the world. And there is medical research that shows us that when gratitude is the focus of our life, stress hormones literally decrease. Our body begins to change when our mind begins to focus on the good and on what we have and on our good God. Our muscles relax. It transforms the way we move. It alters our breathing and our interactions with one another. There's scientific evidence of it. I think it's fascinating that simply writing down 3 things you're grateful for every day will change neural pathways. They could do a PET scan on you, and your brain would be different if we write down or we speak 3 things every day that we're grateful for. 21 days, our brains actually change. We are created for gratitude. We are created for worship of our God, who is the giver of all good gifts. 21 days to a grateful heart. By the way, they gave out Hershey Kisses to the children and said, eat one every day and say something sweet that you have in your life. So there's always that. If you don't want to write, just get some Hershey's Kisses and thank God each time you eat a kiss. Even in the most challenging times, it's possible to be grateful for our blessings. I've seen many saints in nursing homes that don't have a lot to be jumping up and down about, and yet their faith is strong and they're able to count their blessings. We may not be able to change the facts of a situation, but we always have the power to choose how we perceive it, and then in turn how we respond. I had a woman tell me very candidly one time when I was grumbling and mumbling, you see what you look for, and I have never forgotten it. Do we see the miracles around us? We certainly had one on the screen this morning, didn't we? Are we grateful for the miracles around us? Are we grateful for the small blessings, the large blessings? You've heard the story. I think it's more poetic than statistical, but if you have food in your refrigerator, if there's any money in your bank account this morning, are you wearing shoes this morning in church? If so, your life is better than 75% of the human beings on planet Earth. Don't know if that's statistically accurate, but it's very close. If you have an education and can read, your life is better and gives you more potential than the majority of people on planet Earth. God has a life in mind for us, all of us, all the world, that is so much richer and so much more purposeful and so much happier sometimes than we dare to dream. But it doesn't come through acquisition of stuff, and it certainly doesn't come through grumbling and complaining. I always ask, and I know this, I have my calendar correct, so I know I'm not Thanksgiving weekend, but next week is Christ the King Sunday, and I wanted to be sure and honor that. But I always ask on the Sunday before Thanksgiving for people to just shout out one thing they're truly grateful for, a word or a phrase. So think about it for a moment. I wish we had time. Well, actually, we have a little time, but I wish we had time for stories, but we don't. So just think of a phrase or a word or a concept that you are grateful for this morning, and let's end with a testimony before God and one another of what our hearts are thankful for. Anybody have something this morning that they would shout out that they're thankful for? I'm with you. Music. Yes. Friends and family.